Welcome back to Washing with the Word. My name is Andy. I'm very pleased to be able to spend this time together with you looking at God's Word. Let's start together in our reading in Leviticus, starting in chapter 23. We may feel like these are perhaps not applicable to our lives today, but I would actually beg to differ. These are entirely relevant to us. For example, Leviticus 23 gives us various holidays and feasts that God demands that His people celebrate. The reason for this is because life under God's rule and in God's kingdom is worth celebrating, and we ought to remember the good things that God has done for us and to us. So it is right to observe these holidays, not necessarily the ones that are included here in the text, but it is good to go ahead and celebrate God as appropriate. And I think that's what the behaviors are established here in this text. Now in chapter 24, there are some laws about proper conduct and provision for the tabernacle. There is a certain way that we ought to behave in and around and for God's house. Now, whether or not we have certain baked breads or certain candlesticks lit is actually beside the point. The point here is that our behavior and our conduct matter significantly to God. We should watch what we do in and around His house. There is also a severe punishment for blasphemy. We should not take God's name in vain. We should not curse God. God is not worthy of any such behavior. To do so is a grievous offense to Him. We should be very wary of that. Also, we have here the very famous legal principle, eye for an eye. There's a passage that dictates what the correct punishments are. And I think this is a bit of my own aside here, but sometimes I think we can get caught up in somebody did this to me, therefore I must do this to them. I actually feel like the legal principle is the other direction. Somebody did this to me, therefore my punishment to them should be limited. It should be commensurate to the crime. I should not kill somebody because they took out my eye. An eye for an eye, but no further. I think it's a limiting principle rather than a guiding principle. Chapter 25 in Leviticus, there are behaviors for society. There's a Sabbath year where people take an entire year off, their fields lie fallow, and they are able to celebrate their harvests in the previous years. There's also a very special year called the Year of Jubilee that happens once every 50 years where property is returned to its original owners despite its sale status. Certain working contracts are canceled and people return to their families. If property is sold due to financial difficulty, there are laws in this chapter about a redemption process so that both the buyer and the seller are treated fairly throughout the entire encounter. Also, there are provisions for neighbors who become destitute, who fall into financial distress and need some help. These are good ideas for us to follow, not necessarily, again, to the letter of this particular law, but just guiding principles that there are right ways to treat each other when it comes to buying and selling, as well as when we find each other in financial difficulties. Chapter 26, there's a very long discourse on blessings for obedience and curses or wrath or judgment for disobedience. God is keeping a tally of the things that we do. It is incumbent upon us to obey Him fully and in all things. If we are to fail to do that, God's wrath will come down on us. And lastly, chapter 27, there are vows of property. There are some things that are God's just because God already owns them, as He does all things, but there are some things that ownership does belong to us, but that we vow to God. We ought to be able to behave appropriately in both instances, to be able to keep both categories separate. We can recognize what is God's. We can recognize what we give to God becomes His, and we behave according to those principles appropriately. So if we turn our attention to Acts chapter 24, we can pick up our story here with Paul. Paul has been put on trial. He has been falsely accused, done nothing wrong. There is no legitimate crime, but he's in front of a Roman procurator, I believe. His name is Felix. And he argues for himself. He advocates for his upright conduct. And Felix later visits him, wants to find out more about it, and Paul talks with him. Now, during this talk, Felix becomes very nervous, and he backs off very quickly. The reason is because he actually wanted to try to get some money for Paul. He was looking for a bribe. But Paul was he was advocating so well for his position and for the truth of the gospel that Felix began to realize, I am a sinner under condemnation. But rather than to accept the gospel, his reaction was to flee from it. In chapter 25, Paul is still incarcerated, but there is a new person in charge, a new governor. His name is Festus. And during this time, Paul had appealed to Caesar, but Festus knows of no crime with which Paul has actually been charged. And it is not customary to send a prisoner to Caesar without a written record of the crimes that this person has been accused of. Because there is no legitimate crime, there is no such record, so Festus is in a bit of a problem. He's got himself an issue that he has to deal with. So he asks another person, his name is Agrippa, to help him come up with something to write before Paul goes to Caesar, so that way the legal customs are maintained. In chapter 26, Paul is speaking with Festus and Agrippa at the same time, and he makes his defense. He's very passionate, he's very persuasive, he's intelligent, he puts a lot of thought into it, he presents it well, and advocates for himself in this manner. In fact, he is so persuasive that Festus has become convinced that Paul is actually insane. He feels like he's become so smart that it has warped his mind. And even Agrippa has to fight pretty hard in order to resist being convinced by Paul's defense. Well, this also means that Paul's defense is very successful. And it's so successful that they want to release him. Paul's legal problem should be over, but because Paul has appealed to Caesar he must go. And with this, the chapter ends. Then we pick up in chapter 27, where Paul begins making his journey to Rome. He's sailing on a ship to Rome, but bad weather happens as they're crossing the Adriatic Sea. This weather hampers the journey, and the ship becomes endangered, to the point that the crew begins to despair. The ship is therefore grounded intentionally on a reef in order to make for land. They reach an unknown island and just say, "This'll do," and they decide to swim to shore. In chapter 28, it turns out that this island is Malta. It is inhabited, and the inhabitants of the island welcome them and they care for them. And after some time, they do resume their journey to Rome. They sail on a ship out of Alexandria and make it to the capital. There, Paul lives under guard for 2 years, and he's waiting for his appeal. And during this time, he continues to preach the gospel faithfully. And here, the story in Acts ends. We do not get to see Paul's appeal to Caesar. And the whole point of all of this is not just to create some legal drama. It's to show that God's gospel is advancing in the world through these ordinary means of just everyday life. And it is our responsibility, just as it is Paul's, to advocate for the gospel both in our conduct and in our speech. We ought to follow his example so that God's kingdom may spread to all corners of the world as well as all corners of our hearts. Thank you for this time. It's wonderful to share it with you.